To the first panel for Catastrophe, Cataclysm, and the Singular Accident. Our first panel consists of three speakers: Tom Kohut, The Times of Catastrophe, Andrew Milne, Action and Nostalgia, Surviving Simulation, and Michelle Teran, From Mortgaged Lives to Social Work Campaign, some notes about the fight to housing movement in Spain. So I'll introduce Tom. He's a new media art critic, curator, and theorist living in Winnipeg, and he's written nationally and internationally for arts magazines, academic journals, exhibition catalogues, and scholarly books on film, video, visual art, sound art, and bioart. He has presented papers on surveillance art, cybernetics, entropy, and digital media at the University of Manitoba, Video Pool Art Center, and the 2015 International Symposium of the Electronic Arts. His recent publications include BioArt and Biotechnological Singularity in Transformations and Noise Pollution, and the Ecopolitics of Sound, Toxicity, Nature and Culture in the Contemporary Soundscape in Leonardo Music Journal Politics of Sound issue. He is the co-editor of Marshall McLuhan and Vilém Flusser's Aesthetic and Communications Theories Revisited, and is presently writing on Canadian post-cinema.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to the exhibition that all the artists worked really hard on, and Milne and I certainly did as well. And so what's going to happen right now is something that rests somewhat uneasily within the genre of the sort of curatorial talk, per se. But it's more of a sort of systematization of sort of ideas that I had while I was putting together the show and thinking about some of the artworks that were part of the exhibition. So let's begin by asking an obvious question, but what is it that we mean when we say that we live in an age of catastrophe, or that this is an age of catastrophe? It's not as though such things as famine, pestilence, war, social collapse, genocides, great exterminations, environmental problems are new to the species. The confluence suggested in the title of the symposium, the confluence of cataclysm and catastrophe, suggests as the sort of etymological situation, as the sort of etymology is the last refuge of the scoundrel, right? So I'm no exception to that. The etymology of catastrophe, catastrophe, is a downturning. To cataclysm is kata, down, and kloisen, to wash. So it's like a deluge, a downwash. The confluence of cataclysm and catastrophe suggests a deluge of overturnings, a situation in which sudden changes, experienced as falls or downturnings, have become the normative historical terrain. This terrain is one marked, as we'll find out, by tensions produced by the sort of trauma that Freud postulated in his Beyond the Pleasure principle. The very first trauma, which was the moment when organic life, sort of the formative scission from which the organic emerged from the inorganic. And it's like in a section of Beyond the Pleasure principle that Freud continually apologizes for as he's writing it. It's very interesting in that respect. It's like where a vesicule, as the English translation puts it, emerges from the inorganic and forms a sort of shell by a sort of autoimmune sort of self-suicide. It sort of turns parts of itself into inorganic matter in order to protect itself from the sort of inorganic overstimulation. And we'll get to these tensions and stimulations later on. But anyways, this traumatic terrain, traumatic terrain, which, as René Thome's work, Structural Stability and Morphogenesis, in which is basically, like, to put it very, is work of biology, but it's also work of mathematics and many other things besides, in which forms structures succeed one another by means of like complete structural alterations. Now these are stable forms that completely transform themselves. And these can be expressed mathematically, retrospectively, primarily. And so they suggest that this is a sort of body of work that happens topographically, which is to say synchronically, as well as diachronically in terms of history, in terms of succession of forms through time. So the suturing of the notion of cataclysm to this purely formal notion of catastrophe means that the tensions that I've mentioned about emerging from the sort of formative scission of the organic from the inorganic have reached, when they're suited to the notion of cataclysm and catastrophe, reach a certain pitch of intensity such that the conservative position of, 'twas ever thus, is no longer, tenable or desirable. As Slavoj Žižek has asserted, the notion that things have, how things are now is pretty much how they've always been and will always continue to be. There is where the dreams of an impossible utopia reside. So the question then becomes the old Leninist one, "Čo dělat?" What is to be done? Žižek, in his book Living in the End Times, which is a very, sullen cover there, speculates that the global capitalist system, this is a quote from him, so you can imagine Žižek saying it, people in the front, put your spray guards up. The global capitalist, I do a good Žižek actually, but I'm not, drunk enough. No. Later at the book launch. The global capitalist system is approaching an apocalyptic zero point. And he adds that the four riders of the apocalypse are comprised by the ecological crisis, the consequences of the biogenetic revolution, imbalances within the system itself, in particular problems of intellectual property and forthcoming struggles over raw materials, food and water, and the explosive growth of social divisions and exclusions. Now, the usefulness of this formulation of Žižek's is its comprehensiveness. It comprises ecological disasters such as hurricanes, droughts, and major things like great extinctions, biopolitical contestations like gene patenting, the potential threat of bioterrorist activity of some kind, technological accidents such as chemical spills, nuclear power station meltdowns, wars over resources, oil obviously, but access to mineral resources that most of our technology depends on, sort of things that are, that mineral that's in Congo that's ruining everybody's lives there, that's, in things like this. The various means by which populations are exploited, colonialisms, all of that, all the sort of forms of exploitation. However, the conclusion that Žižek draws from this idea that we're reaching an apocalyptic zero point, while seductive, is certainly problematic, given its theological implications of apocalyptic thinking as such. Remembering that Greek apocalypse is, again, etymologically related to revelation. This isn't a problem for Žižek. He's interested in Carl Schmitt, who sort of developed the notion of political theology, in which political concepts are generally secularized theological concepts. But I'm going to suggest that the secularization doesn't go far enough, and that the thinking of the point of apocalypse, or this sort of like we're reaching this apocalyptic point, operates as a peremptory mode of cognitive mapping in which the structure of a narrative, specifically the teleology of revelation, substitutes for cogent analysis. So rather than agents of destruction, these four horsemen should be understood as basins of attraction, which we have a little definition here. Basically, that these sort of are areas where sort of these strange attractors, or like where sort of points of chaos and catastrophe sort of like coalesce, are grounded or are conditioned to some degree by these sort of basins. Here's another one. So it's at this point, rather than in understanding these sort of these four sort of categories as basins of attraction, we then can return to the question of the sort of tensions of endogenous exogenic tensions and endogenic tensions. This is the point that Reza Negarestena writes in his paper Globe of Revolution, an afterthought on geophysical realism, which you can get on his website. And he distinguishes between exogenic tensions, which the full quote is there, but I'll just read the sort of important part. Exogenic tensions, which result from an incisional form of trauma that simultaneously separates the interiorized horizon from its exterior backdrop and sets it against the exteriority, which is posited as external and exorbitant. In short, trauma as amputation. And then there is endogenic tensions, which which express the inassimilable presence of the universal continuum within the regional field, an inassimilable presence of, try that again, express the inassimilable presence of the universal continuum within the regional field, a resident yet alienating presence that has been bored or nested into the horizon from different angles, sort of the insider. There are other names we might call it. This is trauma as transplantation. The speculative question that I would like to now turn to is, how do these two traumatic tensions operate in each of the four basins mentioned? Ecological catastrophe, biogenetics, access to resources, and social divisions and exclusions. So in the case of the first basin, ecological disaster, the incisional tension that cuts an exterior from an interior operates through the inaugural separation of nature and culture. In this situation, nature is put by this very, sort of summarized by this very fine book, Ecologies of Thought, which I strongly recommend. Nature is separated from culture and is understood as a divine order, a sort of a fellow creature or organism in the cybernetic mode, a computer, or a biosphere. However thus conceived, nature functions as the ground on which the drama of human continuation and or extinction is enacted, an exorbitance that either energizes or extinguishes the species of human beings, of Homo sapiens. Climate change, for example, would, from this traumatic perspective, be the name of this exorbitance, which structures the position and behaviors of the actors. In the case of the endogenic tension of transplantation, which is also a perforation, we might also look at the two temporal modes that climate change and ecological disasters function. Here's where the tension resides. On the one hand, the big event, the earthquake, the volcano, the hurricane, the tsunami. On the other hand, drought, soil erosion, the gradual increase or decrease of a particular organism, whether it's jellyfish off the coast of Japan or Scotch broom on Vancouver Island. A singular event and a slow a slow invasion. The endogenic tensions that occur between these two temporalities are amplified by the entangled nature of the relation between nature and culture, the means by which nature, as is demonstrated by Anthony Smith here, is perverse and is immanent in the most empirically synthetic of situations. Turning to the second basin, the question of biogenetics, Zizek, I think, is being a bit imprecise here. And so when we refer to this one, we refer to what's known as the NBIC convergence, which is the convergence of nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science, whose radically transformative project involves the technological reengineering of the human being. The cataclysmic feature here is that the richness of the embodied consciousness of the world can be, in NBIC, reduced, and the traditionally intractable first-person perspectival features such as the now, personal identity through time, and unity of conscious are not so much explained as explained away as neurochemical epiphenomena subject to chemical or technological manipulation. Exogenic tensions operate through a metonymic chain here, a metonymic chain of distinctions between the given and the made, the human condition and human nature, human beings and sort of post-humans or transhumans or inhumans. The cataclysmic potential of these tensions, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, in his essay Some Pitfalls in the Philosophical Foundations of Nanoethics, argues, is that NBIC attempts a mistaken synthesis between the human condition, in which death and birth and death and disease are inevitabilities, and human nature, raising, quote, questions about the impact of technologies on human nature to which no answer can be given, thereby allowing these technologies to avoid raising the same questions with respect to the human condition. Human nature is, for Dupuy, devoid of knowable characteristics. It's malleable. The question of human nature is, this is a quote from him, is unthinkable for the very good reason that such a question holds meaning only within a theological framework that NBIC, among other things, dispels. The human condition, however, can be characterized as an inextricable mixture of things given and things made, a fragile equilibrium between the givenness of birth, death, and death, etc., in the human condition and the made of human nature. The catastrophe of this conflation between the given and the made, and this is similar to the sort of necessary separation between nature and culture, is in its failure to make the necessary scission between the given and the made, between the condition and the natural. The temptation to believe that, quote, we can modify the properties of human nature using the same techniques that have proved so successful in allowing us to manipulate the properties of other entities. The amputative tension must be made, in fact, the tension must be continued in order to maintain the human in the face of the exorbitance of the NBIC conflation of givenness and made. What to make of the endogenic tensions? How are the given and made transplanted into one another? This, in a sense, would be the inhuman within the human, or the human within the inhuman. Do it. Here, the question of prosthesis, I would suggest, becomes important. I'm running out of time.
Sorry. It's always the case.
Well, we'll do this quick. And the question of prosthesis, as Freud again mentioned in Civilization is Discontents, man, as it were, has become a sort of prosthetic god. And so the human tool interface is not merely of evolutionary convenience, but is fundamental to the definition of the human. Humans are ontological assemblages in which tool and organic content are already in a state of endogenic tensions. Nope. Two more. What is? We'll go through this quickly. Endogenic tension. There are two firmer basins, and so we'll have to do this fairly schematically. Access to resources. Exogenic tensions basically are sort of like who has rights to those resources and who does not have rights to those resources. We can see there's sort of like who is able to enclose the commons, things like potable water, things like intellectual property that you think should be there for everybody. Endogenically, these demonstrate themselves in what in disaster capitalism. Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism what David Harvey refers to as accumulation through dispossession, in which something terrible happens and then those that can swoop in and take access to basically what they can get. The last basin is the increasing establishment of social divisions, exogenically along the global north and the global south, endogenically by migrant workers, for example. Basically that which is I have a very clever thing here, but I'm going to maybe we'll discuss it in the questions. Between migrant workers, people who are already here but can't be here. Interestingly, migrant workers and indigenous populations who, if the former sort of have, if this problem of the former of migrant workers can be said that, as Badiou says, as if you are here, you have always been here. In the case of indigenous people, they have in fact always been here. So. Last paragraph, and then that's it. So to return to Freud, these sort of 8 tensions that we've discussed, it's very dangerous to allow these tensions to remain unbound. The psychic health, if not the very survival of the organism, depends on their binding. And this is why Freud became interested in war neurosis or shell shock. I've found the strange situation in which soldiers would dream, which is usually a source of wish fulfillment on what is objectively, the worst moment of their life, seeing their friends blown to pieces. And he thought that through this repetition in dreams, in play, whatever means, bound these tensions and prevented them from being sort of free and destructive. It is here that art, and particularly the artworks in this exhibition, take on their interest. By binding, through oniric activity, through ludic activity, we are able to create a binding synthesis of the destructive tensions. The synthesis of exogenic tensions, the amputation from the inside, from the outside, enables a relative degree of structural stability. Whereas the binding of endogenic tensions, the perforation and transplantation of the outside of the inside in a vermicular structure, generates the temporalities which are exemplary in the catastrophic situation. Now, while it is always dangerous to overvalue art's speculative capacities, it is the work of art's ability to inhabit imaginatively the temporalities of catastrophes before, during, after, and the simultaneity of these 3 orientations that enables the possibility of the navigation through a catastrophic terrain. The world and the universe will end, whether we like it or not, whatever or whomever we have become when that final series comes to its point of saturation. But it is arguably the capacity of the imagination and the understanding operating in symbiosis that will enable, if not survival, then the complete articulation of the stable and mutable structures of the world and time that is the promise of art and of speculative modernity as such.
Just a little background on Andrew. Andrew John Milne is a self-taught Winnipeg-based interdisciplinary artist who interweaves new media, film, photography, and performance. He has a background in mechanical, electrical, and software design, contemporary dance, photography, and film. In this work, Milne approaches cutting-edge media with obsolete technologies and materials, these anachronistic yet functional devices that draw mechanism into a post-cinematic dream space that realizes future mechanisms of seeing and quantifying. Milne is the founder of the Museum of New Ideas, a mobile new media exhibition and studio space, and is a founding member of Bent Light, a post-cinematic collective.
Hi, thank you for coming today. Thank you to Video Pool and the various funders that have made this event possible. I'm going to be fully analog today. There's no PowerPoint. And you can see my talk is written on these large pieces of paper. There is some typing at the end just to keep things clear as we close out. But I'm just going to launch into it because there's not a lot of time. Tom asked me to be less than 20 minutes, and I endeavor to be so. But I thought it would be nice, actually, to start off with some of the discussion after Paul's talk, and this was connected with my talk, and I was kind of not sure if I should include it, but I will. This is a short story by Georges Louis Bourget called On Exactitude in Science, and I'll just read it to sort of, I guess, color the room before I begin. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the cartographers' guilds struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness it was that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of the sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of the map inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So I will be talking about in many ways the politics between digital and analog space, which probably seems like an obsolete conversation, but seeing as that's my milieu, here we go. I'll just introduce myself and my background, since a lot of these ideas come from my artistic practice and a collection of my training. But I have a training in jazz performance, in saxophone from in Vancouver, and done a number of special projects in computer music and artificial intelligence. As mentioned, I have a diploma in electrical engineering technology from British Columbia Institute of Technology. And I also have completed special studies at the professional program at the School of Contemporary Dancers here in Winnipeg. So in discussing the politics of digital space, which the research has sort of spanned my artistic practice and also kind of my personal life, but really centering around photography and the tensions between the analog photograph and the digital photograph, and really searching for some kind of way to resolve those ideas, and ultimately had kind of given up on the conversation as of a few years ago, in that the way that everyone just seems to be moving on, and I was like, I can't really talk about this with enough clarity to justify it, so I will maybe move on too. Some of the sources for the ideas that I will discuss, as I mentioned, come from my art practice involving a self-inflicted physical computing, walk-in camera obscuras, a practice of simulating digital processes with analog technology. The external sources really hang on around an essay by Kendall L. Walton, written in 1984, called Transparent Pictures on the Nature of Photographic Realism, as well a book discussing technoscientific knowledge spaces by David Turnbull, entitled Masons, Tricksters, and Cartographers. And I don't quote that directly, but there's sort of like the ideas of that work are all over the place, and it is a fabulous book if you ever have a chance to check it out. And if you want to check with me later, I'll give you the reference. And as well, Jean Baudrillard, in particular, The Perfect Crime and Simulation and Simulacrum. So the title of the talk, Action and Nostalgia, Surviving Simulation, is really to set up a duality between digital space and analog space in relation to a conversation around simulation. Upon beginning my exploration in photography some 20 years or so ago, I recall the availability of digital photographic equipment coming onto the market, being very troubled by the difference between an analog and a digital photograph, and being totally incapable of articulating in any kind of clear way what the difference was. Throughout the enduring time, I've read numerous publications and critical writings on the subject, but have ultimately never gained a satisfactory description of the relations until, ta-da, this summer. So the model that I will propose is very much in its infancy, and there are some glaring vulnerabilities and limitations. But it's the first time I've sort of been excited about the conversation in a long time, because I think there's some fruitful things to be gained from applying this particular lens to the issues at stake. I'll save that for later. So, connecting photography to simulation, conventional critiques of photography, sort of the tenets of Andre Bazin, Susan Sontag, Roland Barthes. There's a great amount of energy that's spent dealing with the opacity of the photograph, in the way that the photograph masks reality, obscures reality, colors it through the eye of the photographer. And I read these and was quite convinced of all of these sorts of ideas until I stumbled across this essay by Kendall Walton, and I shouldn't jump ahead of my notes. Yes, I was convinced of these perspectives, and in reading Kendall L. Walton's essay, it really jolted these ideas, and he sort of lists off their various ideas and says, "Pshaw," which I was like, what are you doing? You can't sweep that under the rug. But what he points out, as he goes on and gives example after example, it's quite convincing, is that what sets photography apart from the images of its time is not its opacity, but ultimately its transparency. He suggests that while critiques of the idea that a photograph enables one to see if one were there in person are well formed, what is overlooked is that the photograph still enables a seeing. And through the photograph, a seeing through the photograph, regardless of any distortions that are present. And he sort of makes the most compelling argument to me, or example to me, was when you're at the circus and you're standing in front of a fun mirror, there's a sense of you are completely distorted, reorganized, and rearranged, and yet you would still say you see yourself through that experience. And that the idea that a photograph works in a similar way, although it distorts, it still enables this transfer of light and mechanical relation to the real object, for better or worse, in terms of that terminology. Sorry. So, jumping back into my notes from my little soliloquy there. Distinctions. So he's making at that time it's pre-digital photography. So he's making distinctions between the analog photograph and the painting, and that you would, if you saw a painting of Abraham Lincoln, you wouldn't say you see Abraham Lincoln, although if you saw a photograph, you would. So these ideas were sort of new and fresh for me, and I then reconsidered digital photography and my relation to digital media in the context of this sort of approach to analysis in terms of how it relates to seeing. And what I found is that my knowledge of digital processes and the functioning within the camera is that digital photography seems to have a lot more in common with painting on a technological level than it does with analog photography, in the sense that a representational painter will examine the scene, determine the proportions of everything involved, evaluate color, and based on those evaluations will then proceed to reconstruct the scene in this sort of manual, additive fashion. And that under the hood, a digital camera is essentially working in a similar way. And although a mechanistic and algorithmic process, it's ultimately a constructed mechanistic algorithmic process, and that the software and firmware that is functioning in the camera is a distillation or a sort of a freezing of time of mental processes from a programmer or a team of programmers that have decided that this is what's going to happen. Again, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time jumping in and out of my notes as I start to freeform a little bit. Yes, I talked about that. Very good. Digital transfer. Yes, this is good. So yes, we have arrived. We've reconnected. So from there, it seemed much more that the digital photograph was similar in what my understanding of a simulation was. And I had never really considered image in terms of simulation before, much to my naivety, I think. But to me, it was a new idea. And so then I proceeded to then go pursue some reading on simulation and theory on simulation. Yeah, I talked about that as well. So we'll just have a little technological aside here, just because it's anyone that is familiar with this conversation will say, but surely in the digital camera, the photons are coming in and they're hitting the sensor, and at an analog level, they cause a bit to be registered, and then that goes in. So isn't there still a physical connection even in this physical space? And I think this little aside actually is this incredibly profound conversation that potentially relates to Paul's and quantum computing, and why aren't we doing it with transistors is a big question mark that I'll throw out there. But the way a transistor functions is essentially an amplifier, and the relationship between amplifier is there's a direct, if you will, physics, real-world relationship between the input and the output of an amplifier. Although the output of the amplifier is limited in the sense that it takes an input source or power and then amplifies that, makes that larger by taking power from a second source and then modulating that power in proportion to the input that it receives. But the limit of its output power is regulated by the limits of this secondary power source. And in electronics, you call this the power rails, which sometimes they're positive and minus, but typically you would say in TTL digital logic, you have a 5-volt power supply and you have a ground, and then that difference of 5 volts represents the range of output of an output transistor. So the way transistors are discussed is that they have what are called these rails. In other words, it can go up to 5, it can't go higher, and it can go down to 0, and it can't go lower. But in between there is what's called the linear region. And in the linear region, there's a proportional relationship between the input and the output. However, the way it functions within a digital environment is you're actually pushing the transistor up to the rails. And so the transistor will either sit at 5 volts or it'll sit at 0 volts. And the gain of the transistor is increased such that you're always against one of the rails depending on the input that it receives. Except in TTL, which did unusual things sometimes, but they got rid of that because they didn't like it. So in this chain, the light is coming into the digital camera, hitting their sensor, and you have this sort of mechanical, physical, if you will, quantum relationship up until you reach that quantification through analog to digital conversion, and at which point there's a quantification and measurement, and you're actually breaking this direct physical link. So even though you're still operating within physics in the real world, there's no longer this direct link across, which for semantics is important. So jumping back into simulation, hopefully this is somewhat making sense still, is that in considering digital images, it seemed to expand as I considered digital space, that not only was the digital image a simulation, but that in fact digital space itself is also a simulation, and potentially of which I'm more and more convinced, that digital space is incapable of being anything other than a simulation. So in order to talk further about simulation, it's important maybe we throw some definitions out there. So we'll just do the Wikipedia sort of grand tour. Simulation, according to Wikipedia, is the imitation and operation of real-world processes over time. The act of simulating something first requires that the model be developed. This model represents key characteristics or behaviors or functions of the selected physical system or process. The model represents the system itself, whereas the simulation represents the operation of the system over time. And then, excuse me, simulacrum is, which comes from the Latin term simulacra, which means likeness or similarity. It is a representation or imitation of a person or thing. The word was first recorded in English language late 16th century, used to describe representations such as statue, a painting, especially of a god. So, in Going to Baudrillard, he says a lot of very terrifying things, but also provides what he calls the precession of simulacrum as a way of, I guess, classifying or examining a simulacrum. So he's sort of got 5 levels of that, so I'll just cruise through those. The level 1 of your simulacrum is a reflection of a profound reality. So potentially that's what's happening inside your eyes. Also in realistic photography, you could argue that's happening to some extent. And then so it's sort of this desire to reflect reality in as much quality as, or direct truth, I guess, as possible. The second layer is a simulacrum that masks and denatures a profound reality. So arguably, photography also lives in this world where you're representing and you're also misrepresenting at the same time. The third is that it masks the absence of a profound reality. So you're showing a reality that hides the fact that there isn't one behind. The fourth level of simulacrum is that it has no relation to reality whatsoever. And the fifth level is that then you are in pure simulacrum and it's sort of a self-referential space, which he calls the hyperspace. So when we consider analog and digital photography in terms of these categories, it is, here we go, jumping back in. Let's see where we want to go here. Analog processes, temporal distortions. Yeah, I think we're good there. So, yes, in considering digital photography or digital processes in general, there was something that was very interesting happening in a conversation with Rebecca Barker, a media artist from Halifax, while I was out there on residence earlier this year. And in a conversation, she pointed out it's interesting that digital film is in some ways a lot more like film than video, which is this, when you think about it, is an incredibly counterintuitive model, but also reveals the degree to which the digital space is involved in simulation. So the digital camera is actually a simulation of an analog camera. And so the attempt to evaluate a digital image against an analog image in some ways is a bit missing the point, because the simulation already started in the camera. That the camera you're using to make this image is a simulation of another camera. And so you have a mechanism that's simulations of other mechanisms. And so then the line between where how you're advancing through your precession of simulacrum becomes very difficult to see and very difficult to detect. So we'll just leave that there. So yes, another consideration is within the digital space, I have huge question marks as to why digital photography even exists at all. Because when you consider the nature of film and the nature of analog photography, that their characteristic is, we'll just speak about film for sake of simplicity, is that you have a sequence of images, they exist on a strip of cellulose, those images can move, you shoot those images in sequence, they go on and then you can reproject them and you can move the images this way, or if you're really creative, you can turn it upside down, or you can put it into something, an optical printer, which will then rearrange the order of those images, but you're still working with these physical substrates. And so there are physical constraints on the medium that dictate what you can do with it and what you can't do with it, what you're capturing, because the emulsion only captures light. And so the entire structure of the medium is dictated by what is technologically possible. Whereas in digital space, none of those constraints exist. There's no reason you need a sensor in the camera that captures light. There's no reason that your images need to be captured and organized in a temporal fashion, that they need to be played back in a forwards or backwards orientation, that they need to be spatially related to each other. And so the entire construct of digital cinema is to maintain the illusion that analog cinema still exists, when actually, I mean, it does, because we still have analog cameras and you can still shoot film, but there's this bizarre kind of reconstruction of what we already have to validate this thing that we've just created, even though we're not doing anything that it's actually capable of doing. So yeah, it's this, super interesting kind of relation. So what we have is that, I'll just throw this out there as my perception. I have no profound quotes to back it up. But I think if you're in a space where the digital space is only capable of simulation, ultimately because it is a gathering of information, a recording of information like a library or repository, it is impossible to make any new discoveries inside of the simulation. It's like going inside a flight simulator and trying to discover something about flight that hasn't previously been known. Because you're in a simulation, the only information that is available to you is the information that has been programmed into the simulation that pre-existed in the model. And so then the analog world, or the physical analog space, becomes the only site of action, and that the digital environment, somewhat ironically, I think, becomes the true site of nostalgia, in that nostalgia in some ways is the only capable function, in that you are constantly recreating and reconstructing that which is already known and that which has already existed. So the problems of perception that occur is it is very difficult. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I think I'm rambling on. It's very difficult to then discern how the simulacra are advancing. We'll increasingly find ourselves in a Plato's cave situation in which the shadows upon the wall realize what we know. Sorry, double vision. Realize what we know in the context and the architecture of our ignorance. Trying to examine this model used to generate simulation to understand its limitations is a little bit like asking yourself to explain to yourself asking yourself to explain the specifics of your own ignorance. So what are the possible avenues that we have a response to this situation? How do we discern simulation from reality? In terms of Plato's cave, I'll just give you a relatively straightforward answer, which is overly simplistic into something that's quite complex, is that the response to the Plato's cave is that we continue to go outside into the physical world. And as Trevor Paglen suggests, in order to continue to see, we must continue to look. Thank you.
We're going to hear from Michelle Teran, and she's a Canadian-born artist whose practice explores media, performance, and the urban environment. Her work critically engages media, connectivity, and perception in the city. Her performances and installations repurpose the language of surveillance, cartography, and social networks to construct unique scenarios that call conventional power and social relations into question. Currently, she is a research fellow within the Norwegian Artistic Research Fellowship Program at the Bergen Academy of Arts and Design. She is the winner of the 2010 Transmedial Award, the Turku 2011 Digital Media and Art Award, and the Prix Ars Electronica Honorary Mention, and Vida 8.0 Art and Artificial Life International Competition. She lives and works in Berlin.
Okay, so I wanted to start with this short video. This is the beginning of the Occupy movement in Spain, the 15N movement that started in Puerto del Sol, and Ground Zero is actually the geographical center of Spain, and then spread out to other cities and places throughout Spain. So I wanted to begin with that because I wanted to give a little bit of a walk through some of my work I've been doing with post-2011 political movements in Spain, which I would say is divided and talk a little bit about the ways that they're working and the strategies that they're using within the movement. That I would say is broken down into two categories. That would be participatory politics, and also redesigning of systems. Now, this is an image from Puerto del Sol, and I chose this image because it really shows how these activities are taking place in two spaces. They're taking place on the internet, within social media, and also on the streets, within the assemblies, and also the different street actions that are taking place. I wanted to show you this map as well. This was a map that was generated on the 4th anniversary of 15M. And this is a visualization to show like all of the different sort of mutations and alternative imaginations and confluences that have developed as a result of that initial Occupy movement. And I just wanted to say that I'm going to talk about, let's see if I can find it. I'm talking about this. So, yeah, it's quite complex. So I'm going to talk about this social movement that I've been involved with since 2013. And the PA is an acronym. It stands for La Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, which is the Mortgage Victims Platform. And it started in 2009 in Barcelona, and it's a citizen-led movement, a grassroots movement that was developed to deal with the insufficient measures that within the government for dealing with what they saw was a very sort of acute housing crisis, a mortgage crisis, and an unfair mortgage system, and they wanted to make visible these abuses of power by the financial systems. So it started in 2009 in Barcelona, and now it's operating at over 230 nodes throughout the entire country. It really came together during 15M. It was seen as kind of a perfect encounter. But I wanted to give a little bit of context of why there was like a mortgage crisis, just to understand the situation a little bit. I don't really have that much time, but the sort of move to property ownership, it started in late Francoism, but it really started to come together with Spain's incorporation into the European Union. It's quite weird, this light, because I see like this black hole, and then like, so maybe I'll just try and move away a bit. So what was happening is that there was public access of cheap credit, a flow of credit moving into the country. And they really focused on the real estate market as the key to fast and easy growth in the country. And so what was happening is that Spain was constructing more homes than Germany, Italy, and France combined. So it was really sort of emphasis placed on the construction industry. So on one hand, the building boom, and the other hand, if you have all of these spaces, and they're forcing people, putting people into buying, taking on very sort of expensive mortgages through high-risk mortgages, and meaning that people could be, you could lend people to money who are very, very at risk that really couldn't take on such a high mortgage, over-appraising, and then so you ended up being like $350,000 in debt, similar to the processes that were happening in the United States. You could see a lot of parallels. So you have like millions of homes left empty for purposes of speculation, and lots of people with really expensive mortgages. And in 2009, more and more people were having difficulties keeping up payments with their mortgages. There was the economic crash following the meltdown of Lehman Brothers, people started to experiencing a massive foreclosure of their homes. This was also coinciding with high interest rates. So you enter into a mortgage with very low interest rates, and suddenly it was like completely sort of off the scale. So the PA formed under these sort of circumstances, but the statistics is that until from 2007 until now, there have been more than 550,000 foreclosures and 180 evictions per day. So when the housing bubble finally burst, you had like a real sort of a crisis situation. So the PA was operating within that context, but they were operating in a total bubble themselves. It was really, really going against any kind of mainstream messages. So they were operating for a couple of years before 15M, and then it was like the perfect encounter. And you have suddenly this whole mobilization of people. This sudden need to resolve very, very direct problems that were happening in front of you, to your neighbor, to yourself, within your neighborhoods. And so when the squares were empty and people went back into their neighborhoods, they said, okay, now we're going to address like really serious problems. And one of the main core problems was housing. So what you have is you have like the formation of more and more PA nodes, and then you have like the formation of some of the assemblies that were happening in the plaza taking place in the neighborhoods. So asambleas de vivienda, housing assemblies, where people could come in and talk about their personal problems. So the criteria of the PA are sort of broken down into some very, very simple guidelines. One, it's a politically independent, nonpartisan association. You cannot, there's no spokesperson that can be a member of a political party, and you cannot participate in elections or publicly support any political party. It's nonviolent. It's voluntary, so everything that is done within the PA has to come as a free service, and it also means that there can be no contributions from the government or any kind of outsourced sources that would influence what happens. It's all based on collective guidance, and I'll get into that a little bit more because that's a really core thing of what they're doing. And the last thing is that once you fill those 4 guidelines, you have an autonomy to develop your campaigns and how you want to work and within your own neighborhood, because you know your neighborhood, you know the areas that you're working, and so it's not like a big hub that tells you what to do, but you follow these guidelines, and then it kind of filters around. So this is the PA Madrid. This is where I started working in 2013, or I find myself in the first meeting. And you see, this is their website, and you have a list of things that they're doing. And one of the first entries is this thing here, the Asamblea Colectiva de Afectados de PA Madrid. And that's kind of like the orientation space. It's like when you first come in and you don't know what you're going to do, and you're having problems, and then you come in and there's like this orientation. When I came, there was this woman named Rita that unfolds this long piece of paper and begins to have a step-by-step explanation of what are the steps of that from the point that you can't pay to the point that you're going to be evicted, and what are the stages, how long it takes, and at what point you can negotiate. People come in, listen to like this orientation, and then there's like a round of questions. You put your name on a list and you bring in your question, and the idea is that you're bringing in a personal problem, and there's going to be one or more people that has the exact same experience as you, and so it's the idea of building like this collective solidarity. So this based on collective guidance, everybody's experience of your own problems, your own trauma, but there's surely somebody else that has a similar experience than you. Once you have the orientation, then it's broken down into different sort of groups according to what is your specific, in this case, bank groups. Do you have your mortgage with Bankia? And so then everybody goes into a bank group. And then you have maybe 25 cases, and then you present it to the bank branch manager. It's easy to ignore one person, but it's not easy to ignore 25. There's different sort of stages of negotiation that happen. So the idea is that you're constantly sort of putting pressure on the bank, and this is a woman that has just signed a paper which is called what is known as Gaussian Embargo, which is really a strange thing to understand outside of the context of Spain. But essentially, if you lose your house, you still have the debt. So you're left with 200,000 euros in debt. And so there's actually, it's one of the main sort of like things that they're fighting for, is to being able to say, oh, okay, you can take over the property, but I walk away debt-free. So she's signing a paper saying that she's now debt-free. The PA Madrid also started to do workshops, and so according to sort of different skill building workshops. So this one is about evictions, identifications, fines, and fears. And so it's a workshop about civil disobedience. This is a workshop about how to detect abusive clauses in your mortgage contract. So it's about teaching people to become sort of experts of the legal terminology within mortgage contracts. And this is a workshop about how to sort of make full use of social media. So how to use it to your own advantage. So the last step is also, it involves direct action, and this is like when all phases of a negotiation completely fall through. And then the direct action is to place bodies in front of the doorway of the house of the building where people are going to be evicted to prevent that from happening. This sometimes works. The bank doesn't like to have a sort of bad public face, and so just the fact that there's a physical presence and there's media, they'll be open to negotiation, but sometimes it doesn't. Another campaign is, Bankia is like sort of a merge of several financial entities. They were bailed out in 2012 of using 22,424,000,000 euros of public money, and they have like the dubious honor of being the bank that's carried out the most evictions, so 20% of the evictions. So they said the campaign by the PA was like, well, we bailed it out, and so Bankia is ours, like Bankia es nuestra. The campaign is Prepárate Bankia, which means get ready, Bankia. And what they do is that people, when I came last May, I've come in different stages. I arrived in May, and just in time for a bank takeover, we took over Bankia for 5 hours. To negotiate 12 cases and also to prevent eviction that was supposed to be happening that week. So people come in, they take over the bank, make themselves at home. So you can see like there's closed lines, and just really take it over for hours and really force negotiations. When all levels of negotiations there's resistance, then they just sort of up it up and up it up. Occupying banks is one of the main strategies that they use, and this is a recent event with the Ushi case, and Ushi is like this merging between the bank Santander and this financial French multinational bank called BNP Paribas, and they were. It was dealing with a lot of mortgages that were signed during the height of the housing bubble from 2003 to 2005. And they were sort of pushing and targeting young people or people in precarious positions, sort of migrant, unemployed, forcing them to find sort of guarantors for the mortgage. It's like, okay, you can't afford it, so get your aunt to sign it, or your mother, or even somebody that's not known. And the mortgage contracts contained a lot of abusive clauses. But they were functioning the same way as subprime mortgages, and so they were just they had the mortgage and they were resold to sort of other financial entities. And so there was a family of 3 families that were camping out at the door of a bank branch in Sevilla for 200 days or something. And finally there was a mobilization across the country in solidarity, and this led to the arrest of 12 activists from the PA, and including a city councillor. This is Cristina Honorato from Participa of Sevilla. It's there's like these confluences of different sort of organizations that have become part of municipal politics in the last year, and so they are connected to Podemos, which is now coming up with the federal elections. But these confluences are composed of people that have been involved in social sort of movements for many years that are now active in politics. And so this was one of the city councillors that was arrested. Another campaign is a campaign called the Obra Social. And this is again related to a number of like these empty buildings that are properties of banks, because the developers went bankrupt, and so the banks took it over as like these toxic assets. So they're left empty for speculation. They're sort of waiting for the next wave of the housing bubble, and so what you have is you have thousands and thousands of these empty buildings. So the banks became the biggest real estate companies in the country, and so because the banks were bailed out with public money, it's also about like retaking over like these empty buildings as a public commons. So they started the Obra Social campaign in 2012, and what they do is they purposely target these buildings that have been built within the last 10 years. They walk around their neighborhoods, find sort of ideal candidates, look up on the registry just to make sure that there's nobody living in there, and who the actual owner is, and then they take it over in broad daylight. They hang like big banners. There's like loud music. It's like a really big party. And then they use it to move in families and individuals with housing problems, families that have been evicted. So there have been more than 3,000 people that have been rehoused, and 40 buildings recovered from the banks. This is recent. This is one of the Obra Social buildings in Manresa, that's in Catalonia. And they were fighting for this for a year and a half, and finally they negotiate with the bank so they have their situation is more permanent, and they can stay there under a social rent regime, which is 30% of their income. So now they're more permanent. So that's one of the ideas, is that you just don't squat a place, but you immediately start to negotiate with the bank so that you can take it over. So I can see the key is there. They also made like a manual, which is like which shows this link between these properties and also so that homelessness by eviction, and create a step-by-step manual about how to recover your own buildings. I don't have time, but I'm translating this manual right now, and I think translation is one part of my sort of work as an artist within the movement. When I arrived there in 2013, I wanted to know more about the situation, and Ada Colau, who's now currently the mayor of Barcelona, was one of the founders of the movement. And so because I was reading the book and also going to the meetings, she was kind of making like these interpretations, like voices in my head as I was sitting in the meetings, and after a while I started to translate it. So it was translated into English. It's available as a book or a PDF, and it was launched at the Anarchist Book Fair in 2014 with the Radical Housing Network, PA International, and also the publisher that's helping distribute this book. I don't know where to stop.
You could just wrap it up because we don't have much time.
Yeah, okay. So that goes on there.
Whatever works for you, yeah.
Right, okay. I can bring that up later. The related to the film, one of the workshops that are happening around Pa Madrid is this group of support, psychological sort of support, mutual support. And this is a space where people can come and talk about their more personal problems, because it's a very emotional space. There's sort of trauma, it's dealing with trauma. So there's a psychologist that started to have these workshops, eventually decided that she wanted to form a psychosocial impact research team to study the psychosocial impacts of eviction, and that's when I became invited in. And we had a pilot project in 2013 where it was a group discussion with 4 women that had come with their housing problems but became activists and were participants in the group, and we filmed it. And I have been using the material within the development of film and several other things, and they have been using the material as analysis of research. And so it's become a very interesting, exciting time to have these different sort of levels of research coming together, and how I as an artist can sort of use my methods within other contexts besides the art stuff. But this is a group that is formed within the movement. It's not like all of a sudden there's like the experts coming outside, but it's also these different sort of moments and continuous forms of self-reflection and experimentation that's happening within all of these different sort of campaigns and actions that I've just described. So